Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. Um, I've learned a lot from the presentations that I've seen so far, and thanks for sticking around. I know it's a long morning for everybody. So I'd like to talk a little bit about translanguaging, the role of translanguaging in language for special purposes. My name is Eduardo Viana da Silva, and I coordinate the Portuguese program at the University of Washington. Russ, I'm going to ask you to keep me in time just in case if I go too fast. And
I'll put some notes in the chat as the clock goes by.
All right, sounds good. And I feel a little bit guilty that I'm presenting from my sofa, but it's really comfortable to present from your sofa. So translanguaging, here is the concept, or one of the concepts. For us, translanguaging are multiple discursive practices in which bilinguals engage in order to make sense of their bilingual words. Translanguage, therefore, goes beyond what has been termed code switching, although it includes it, as well as other kinds of bilingual language use and bilingual contacts. So this comes from Ofelia Garcia, and I would like to show a little video of her explain this concept, but the main idea is that she explains that we use language in everyday life in different ways, and we, more than just doing code switching, it's also a way of thinking, a way of being in our daily lives. And we don't have just several identities, we have one identity that's complex and that's informed and formed by these languages. So I'll show the first minute here.
So what is translanguaging, right? Translanguaging is using language as a unitary meaning-making system of the speakers. Now, what we have to remember is that translanguaging is always with all of us who are bilinguals, right? You may be hearing what you think is English now, but I am selecting from my unitary repertoire signs that you say they're English and I recognize as English, right? But so it's not that English and Spanish do not exist. It is that from my own perspective, what I have one language repertoire from which I select features that are appropriate to communicate. So, and this was given to me by a child, because always children know best. And it's important to know that I didn't think of this in my head. I saw this because I started out as a bilingual teacher. And all my life I've worked in classrooms with teachers. And I would go in and the teachers would say, oh, today I'm teaching in Spanish. And then I would go in and the children were using their entire language repertoire. The teachers were sometimes also using English. And when I asked one child one day, well, what is happening here? He said to me, well, even though Spanish runs through my heart, English rules my veins.
And I like that, the idea that English is in the veins of this heritage speaker, right? And made me think of myself too. And I like this quote that simplifies the concept a little bit. You know, it permits bilinguals, and I would say multilinguals, to act naturally using language they might at home and in their communities. And if I think of myself, and here is a little cartoon, you know, if the dog saying meow and must be nice to be bilingual, the other two dogs commenting. So I'm thinking of my own life where I use English, Portuguese, and Spanish every day, and I use Spanish with some Spanish-speaking colleagues, and I use English with English-speaking colleagues. But I also, in my own way of thinking, I am a conjunction of all these three languages, right? I'm not like three different people, but I have a way of thinking that's informed by the languages that I speak as well. And language for specific purposes, a more traditional concept, It's focusing, according to Sanchez Lopez, on the student level communicative competence when you create a course for a specific purpose, the urgency to use the language in a professional context. And here I would think that it's not just about professions, it could also be language for a specific purpose, could involve a hobby, an interest that you have. So I like more of that concept. The specific characteristics of such context, right? So if you are learning this language because you are using a corporation or in your community, etc., and the design of a program that promotes the learning process. And here I just thought of translanguage in a variety of contexts, but I chose 3 of them. One is the workplace, so you could think of corporations, universities, such as my case, or even going to a store to buy something and changing your language because of that, all right, or using different expressions. In research, just some examples, research in healthcare, anthropology, and history that use more than one languages, where the researcher uses all the languages that he or she or they know. And personal interests as well, right? So that being a music that you like, a dance that you start practicing, or sports that you are part of. So translanguaging in the workplace. People from different countries and ethnicities working together. So I was thinking, how could you apply that to the language classroom? And one tip would be using the translanguaging tables, which I learned from Dr. Michelle Aoki when I participated in the Star Talk for Portuguese. And translanguage tables are a space in which multilingual interactions are encouraged in the language classroom. So students are able in that space to use English, Spanish, or other languages to understand topics and to talk about things and to clarify things from the class. And we used very successfully in programs at the UW. So here I have some examples of people that navigate between languages. So meet Tim. The picture is not actually him, and neither is his name, but it is a story of a real story of a student at the UW. So Tim recently moved back to Seattle to conduct his MA in space engineering at the UW. He speaks Spanish at the intermediate level, and is taking Portuguese classes and has confirmed an internship position in space engineering at the University of São Paulo. So one thing that Tim did that I thought was very interesting, and I translated that to a tip, and didn't come from me, it came from him. He translated his CV from English to Portuguese prior to look to this position at the University of São Paulo, this internship. So another tip for the language classroom is to encourage students to use keywords in the languages, or to study keywords in the languages they know related to their field of interest. So being anything that they are interested in, right? So it could be music, it could be a career, anything that talks to them. So that would come from the students. And here, let me see if I passed it. Oh, it's not here. Another situation is translanguaging in research. So students conducting research in languages they know. So a tip for the classroom is that research should look for references, for books, for articles in the language that they know about a paper that they are writing. So for one of the classes that we teach in Portuguese, where students write a final paper, we ask them to look for 3 references in Portuguese, and then at least 3 references, and then they have to use other 2 references in English or in other languages, which a lot of the times tends to be Spanish. And here is an example of another student that navigates between languages. So meet Marcus. He learned Portuguese at the UW through a federal grant. he traveled to Brazil to conduct his research, his PhD research in anthropology with an indigenous group in the Amazon forest. As part of his experience, Marcos learned basic Nhangatu, an indigenous language, from the ethnic group that he visited in the summer of 2018. And his research is based in references in Portuguese, in English, and in Nhangatu as well. So a tip for the classroom is that, right? So encourage students to conduct research in languages they know. And although Marcos got a grant to go to Brazil to study Portuguese, we thought it would be important, since he was working with this language, with this indigenous community, that he would learn at least some basic language expressions and greetings in the indigenous language. And that was part of his proposal with the federal government as well. And then finally, personal interests, hobbies. So encouraging language students to find hobbies and interests in languages that they know as well. So for example, in a class, we can ask students to share music that they like, and that can come from different languages that they speak as well. And here's an example of another student. So that's Diane. And Diane likes jazz and started learning Portuguese because of Bossa Nova, which is a Brazilian style of music. The language acquisition of Portuguese for Diana has been a slow process, and she has been able to acquire intermediate low level of proficiency over the years in Portuguese. But when she started learning Portuguese, her main goal was to pronounce the words correctly so she could record her music. And she did, and she could pronounce really well the words in Portuguese, but she didn't speak Portuguese. But her exposure to the language was so big that at some point she decided that she should learn the language as well. So a tip for the classroom is to encourage students to find a hobby, a sport, art, in the language that they know, and get familiarized with that. And I think a big advantage is the contact hours. So in her case, Diane has tons of hours of contact with Portuguese through music, much more than you could provide in the language classroom. Here is a little timeline just showing a few examples of what we have done in translanguaging, in navigating between especially Portuguese, Spanish, and English. We conducted a Star Talk summer camp with focus on STEM for high school students in July of 2017. And we had speakers of Spanish that didn't know any Portuguese. We had speakers of Portuguese that grew up with Portuguese in the classroom. And we used both Portuguese and Spanish in the class, although the class was in Portuguese. In 2018, we have another example of students conducting research in Portuguese in projects in their areas of interest. And just that example I gave before, where they are finding books in different languages, the language that they know. In 2021, in August, we had a cybersecurity course, this in Portuguese, that was offered online for high school students. Same model as the Star Talk with Spanish speakers and Portuguese speakers. And in 2020, we had one student that participated in an online internship with a university in São Paulo, with a company in São Paulo. But he had more Spanish skills than Portuguese, but he spoke some Portuguese as well, probably like an intermediate high level. And after the internship, his language level improved quite a bit. I don't think I can, it's not showing. I had selected some pictures that it's not showing, so I'm just going to skip. So 3 suggestions for the classroom. One is to include translanguaging tables in the language classroom, which might go a little bit against some of the talk that we hear, or I'd say a lot of the talk that we hear about using only the target language in the classroom. So I'm just going to leave that open for discussion. But I am a big fan of having a space for students to ask for clarifications and to use language that they feel very comfortable with in the class. Organizing interviews with professionals also came from the Russian StarTalk program. It's a wonderful system, and I'm sure any of the colleagues in the Russian program or myself, we could explain how we do it. But pretty much you bring a professional to talk to students, and the students conduct the interview with them and welcome the professional in class. And in our case with Portuguese, we had sometimes professionals doing presentations in English, sometimes in Portuguese, and we had students using sometimes Spanish, sometimes Portuguese, or English as well. And finally, promote school projects that allow for translanguaging with a presentation at the end. So it could be a poster presentation that students are doing using several languages. It could be a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, inviting the community, as we did in the StarTalk program. And I believe Russian also do that and used to do as well. But what we did in our program with Portuguese is that students who felt more comfortable speaking Spanish, they would do the presentation in Spanish, and their family would understand if they were heritage speakers, and then would offer a version of the presentation in Portuguese and a summary in English of the presentation. We do have an article that I published with a colleague, that Rosa, that worked with me in the StarTalk program, and here's the link if you'd like to access that. And also feel free to email me at evsilva@uw.edu if you'd like to have more, maybe continue this conversation at another time. I think it's 12:30, so I'm going to stop here. Some ways it was good I couldn't share everything, so I didn't take a lot of the time. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer if there's time, or otherwise I'll pass to Dr. Michelle Aoki.